Welcome everyone to the final week of February Flare Up Health Edition. Today we're going to hear about some of the wildland firefighter health-related studies and programs in Canada. We're going to hear from 7 different people who are leading the charge with regards to both physical health and mental well-being of wildland firefighters. Today's session is going to be a little bit different format than our last 3. We're first going to hear from each of the 7 speakers, and then we're going to end the session with a live Q&A and discussion. As always, post your questions, comments, ideas in the chat box as they come to you, and we'll be sure to acknowledge them during the final portion of the session. I'm coming to you today from Treaty 6 territory in Alberta, and I'd like us all to take a quick moment to think about the places where we come from, the places we reside, we work, and we recreate, and the people who came before. Thanks, everyone. So I'm really excited today. This session is going to be so great. We're so lucky to have so many members of the BC Wildfire Service here sharing the great work going on. Our first speaker is going to be Natasha Broznitsky. Natasha is the Research and Innovation Senior Officer with the BC Wildfire Service. She's going to provide us with an overview of their research and innovation business area and discuss work currently underway on incorporating respiratory protection into the BC Wildfire Service. Natasha, I'd like to welcome you and hand the reins over to you for today.
Thank you, Karen. Just confirming you can see and hear me okay?
Everything is perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction, Karen. I'm really happy to be here today and really happy to be joined by so many folks in the BC Wildfire Service. I'd like to also briefly acknowledge that I am coming to you from the Tla'amin traditional territory. Excited to be here today. As Karen mentioned, I'm currently the Senior Officer of Research and Innovation. I started with the BC Wildfire Service in 2014 on an initial attack crew and have worked in a couple of different roles before moving into the research and innovation business area. And my background is in biology and science writing. And as Karen mentioned, today I'm going to be providing an overview of the business area that I work in that has a large role in the health research that we do. Cover off some research, both recent, ongoing, and planned, and cover an overview of how the BC Wildfire Service is moving forward on respiratory protection. So just to begin, to provide some context of who are we, some faces behind the business area. We were established in 2018. We operate through headquarters Victoria in BC, but only actually Jesse currently lives in Victoria. The rest of us are dispersed throughout the province. And I'm happy to be joined today by both Drew and Jesse. So very happy to have those folks today. We also have one other person who's not on this slide yet. He just started this week. As we're backfilling due to some shifts in our business area due to the Premier's task force on emergencies. So some coming and going in the business area. To provide an overview of what sort of how we sit in the BC Wildfire Service and what we do, I won't read the slide out word for word. I know it's being recorded, so folks can go back and look at anything they'd like to look more at in the slides. But really, we're established to really tackle the BC Wildfire Service's challenges that might be benefited through research or innovation activities. We're here to help other areas of the BC Wildfire Service. And because of this, we work across broad areas of research and innovation. Health, wellness, and safety is a big one for us. It usually requires a lot of engagement and a lot of time. But we also work in areas of social science, wildland fire science, and associated sciences like wildfire recovery topics, and also equipment and technology innovation. And this slide just sort of provides a bit of our mission, our vision, and some of the specific things that we do. I also wanted to provide a brief overview of a bit of a list of health research that we've engaged on over the last 5 years that is not going to be spoken about today. There are projects that have also occurred that we are going to hear from a little bit more later from the other speakers today. But these are a few projects that we've funded and participated in, funded and or participated in over the last 5 or so years. There are publications available for many of them, and we can facilitate some of that sharing as well if necessary or if desired. So moving into a bit of a conversation on respiratory protection and how the BC Wildfire Service has approached that. As we'll hear a little bit more in the next presentation, respiratory protection is not certainly not the only or the first item that an organization like the BC Wildfire Service should be looking at or is looking at when it comes to reducing exposure. But over the last handful of years, we've felt that there is a need and a place for respiratory protection in the BC Wildfire Service, but because of the current limitations of respiratory protection for wildland firefighting, specifically that there is no piece of respiratory protection that exists that meets CNFPA 1984, the standard that is set for wildland firefighting respiratory protection. It's left the BC Wildfire Service and other wildland fire management agencies in a tricky place when it comes to selecting appropriate, effective, and feasible respiratory protection. So I'm going to talk about some of the research and activities that we've undertaken to get where we are and how we're moving forward from here. And I'd also just like to briefly acknowledge that this has been a huge effort in the BC Wildfire Service, just given the sort of volume of research that's contributed to this. Many different crews around the province have participated. You can see a few of them here on the screen. And it's also really taken the partnership of our operational staff in having research come onto the fire line and be integrated with operations, and really all levels of the BC Wildfire Service pulling together towards this. This is a bit of an overview of the items that we have engaged on that are leading to here where we are in 2024. So I'll talk a bit about each of them here moving ahead. In 2019, we began a partnership with the University of Alberta, with Dr. Nicola Cherry, and with the government of Alberta, including Alberta Wildfire, on a project that was just getting started in Alberta, looking at polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and firefighters, wildland firefighters specifically, exposure and absorption, exposure to them and absorption of them. So very briefly, you'll hear a little bit more about polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons from Drew, but they're a suite of compounds that are created when organic material burns. So this includes things like wood. It can also include things like barbecued food, cigarettes, and a wide variety of other types of materials that could create polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons when they burn. Really in 2019, it was about learning, what is the profile of pH exposure in wildland firefighters? Are they being exposed through their skin, through their respiratory system, both? And are there things that we can begin piloting to reduce exposure, both in terms of respiratory protection and enhanced hygiene practices? So I'm not going to read all of the text on all of these slides, but again, you can go back and have a look if you'd like. And these projects, I would say, in and of themselves, have a really important place in the foundation that they created or helped create to increase the knowledge about exposure on the fire line and about developing some of the methodology that wasn't available at the time to study this. So briefly, the high-level result from 2019 was that we did find, or the researchers did find, that NIOSH certified respirators, pictured there on the right-hand side of the screen, did reduce pH absorption, as well as the frequency of cough, nose, and throat irritation. And also, not getting too far outside what we're talking about with respiratory protection, but also that enhanced skin hygiene protocols did reduce post-shift polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon absorption. In 2021, we couldn't conduct research in 2020, unfortunately, due to COVID, so it was delayed to 2021. But this was a follow-up to the research in 2019, where we and the University of Alberta and Alberta Wildfire wanted to look at what does pH absorption look like over a longer period of time, over repeated deployments, whereas the research in 2019 just took place over the course of a couple of days. And what does it look like when people are asked to wear respiratory protection throughout the course of the season, or take part in enhanced hygiene protocols throughout the course of the season? And although N95 use was not popular by everyone throughout the course of a really challenging fire season in 2021 in BC, discretionary use did reduce the amount of absorbed pHs, and this effect was even observed even though many people in that group, in that experimental group, did not wear their respiratory protection a lot. And I won't get into all the detail on this slide, but this work really sort of, I would say, laid the foundation for the work that occurred moving forward and provided a really good foundation, I think, for what polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon exposure looks like in firefighters, how it may be mitigated, and what are the knowledge gaps moving forward, which as the BC Wildfire Service we saw were, okay, respiratory protection can help reduce this, what is actually going to be feasible in terms of a specific type. I also just want to mention this research in and of itself was not just a launch forward into respiratory protection. We took learnings from this and applied them where feasible into the BC Wildfire Service. And these are not all bullets on this slide. Not every bullet on this slide has been applied. Some of these are more possibilities, and some of them are going to be more feasible than others. Some are going to work in some situations, some are not. But the findings of this research and others, other projects that were happening around the same time in other places, did provide specific ideas for how wildland firefighting agencies and other groups could begin to mitigate exposures. Just briefly, a few of the specific things that the BC Wildfire Service did partially in response to the results from those two projects. It helped us buy additional camp infrastructure to help with dermal decontamination in 2020. It's reflected in our new fatigue management guidelines. There's new spaces being built in the BC Wildfire Service, and there's an increased awareness that we shouldn't have our office space where the gear is being stored if possible. And I think that's something that's been known for quite a while in structural firefighting, but really was not well known a few years ago in wildland firefighting. Respiratory protection, protective equipment, of course, which we'll be talking about more. And there's been an understanding that we want to do more exposure assessments, and we're really excited to have Drew helping us with that. And really it's about increasing education awareness and shifting that culture that it's not great, it's not cool to always be the dirtiest person. There's a consequence to that, and just sort of trying to change that culture in the cases that it still exists. Moving on to 2022, we began by trying to select a number of different types of respiratory protection that may have some merit and sent them to a number of firefighters around the province and really just got their opinion on how they fit. Were they comfortable? Did they perform well in their subjective opinion, etc. And I won't go through the graph on the chart on the right-hand side, but we essentially chose a few models from this process to move forward into what we deemed phase 2 of our respiratory protection equipment research and assessment. So this, we sort of considered this as phase 1 here, having them sent out to firefighters, seeing what they liked, that built on the foundational research that I just talked about. And we chose the 3 that seemed to be different and have some potentially some merit to carry on into research that was conducted this past fire season. We were limited to only using 3 different types of respiratory protection in this project, just because of the sheer volume of people that you need to include to have enough samples to hopefully approach something statistically significant in the data analysis. So the 3 types were 1 half-face dual cartridge respirator. The other 2 were variations on cloth masks that people had some interest in. And again, I won't read it out word for word here, but this was quite a large project to carry out, particularly in the kind of fire season we had in 2023. But we did meet the goal of numbers of participants. The goal was 80, we got to 85, and followed them over 3 consecutive days, asking some people to wear the respiratory protection and some people to do what they normally do, which in most cases is not wear anything. Analysis of these results are still underway by the University of Alberta. This is another partnership with Dr. Cherry. And that's not to be unexpected at this time of year. The analysis of results are still underway just based on the volume of samples that were collected for this project. Following on that project, we had 85 people who had respiratory protection from that project, and we offered them the ability to keep the respiratory protection if they wanted to, as well as offered the control group who had not received respiratory protection the opportunity to receive respiratory protection if they wanted to, if they would agree to provide us on feedback under how it would be used realistically, not during a research project, but when they're given respiratory protection and given education about how it should be used, how it shouldn't be used, what it protects against, what it doesn't, how to maintain it, etc. And then, made able to make the choice of when they want to wear it. And Drew is going to get into some of the results of how that looks, of what we found when people are given respiratory protection and wear it when they want. So I'll save that for Drew. But following on that, we added another phase 2.5, we called it, where we went sort of back to what we did in phase 1 and bought even more and different kinds of models of respiratory protection, just as sort of a final, is there anything else that we think might be a fit that sort of improves on something that was included in the research project in 2023, or is a little bit different, but is still certified in the same way by NIOSH? And is there some kind of something about these different types that might make it more or less feasible or more or less comfortable for people to wear? So brought a number of different kinds and tested them again with firefighters, not on the fire line, but just taking them around, letting them try them on, wear them for a while, see how that worked. And we identified a couple of different models of respirators that seem to improve on the Sunstrom, the one on the left-hand side here, the shortcomings of this one, but are certified in the same way. And also identified a couple of N95s that improved on the limitations that are currently stocked by BC Wildfire Service, which were originally stocked for COVID-19. And those models that were used in the research projects in 2019 and 2021. So we took all of that and had to balance out a number of factors to make a recommendation on respiratory protection. They're here. And essentially what we're looking at for 2024 is some kind of N95 respirator with an exhalation valve. N95s are not perfect. They're not going to be suitable in a variety of situations, but they are NIOSH certified to protect against certain types of particulates. And they do have the benefit of not requiring any maintenance, which is a substantial consideration. And they're lightweight, they're easy to pack. They're disposable, which is good and bad. But we think there is a certain situation in some cases where they'll be useful. Also, recommending or moving forward on procuring a couple of different models of half-face dual cartridge respirators with really specific features that were favorable among the people that tried them. And the respirators themselves are NIOSH certified to protect against particulates and gases to the level that they're certified to do that. The specific components that we are really interested in having on these models in the BC Wildfire Service are things like quick latch mechanisms that allow people to take them off their face without having to take their hard hat off. Models that have things like speech diaphragms for clear communications. Communications is definitely something that's affected by respiratory protection, of course. Anything that can make the filters easier to attach and change, and things like a seal check that's easier to do as opposed to sort of the traditional seal checks. I'm getting towards the end of my time here and I don't want to take too much time, but I just want to quickly mention that for us, it's not just about buying respiratory protection, stocking in a warehouse and saying that we're done. Respiratory protection successfully integrated into a workplace and that is done within regulations needs to have a respiratory protection program developed with it. So that's something that is being worked on now. We've been working on it for some time. And the 2024 fire season in BC is really going to be a first step towards a comprehensive respiratory protection program. And the program itself and potentially the models of respiratory protection are going to evolve over time as we really see what works in the BC Wildfire Service and see what needs to change. We also are keeping an eye on developments in other places. I know there's work in the US on a wildland firefighting respirator. Alberta's doing some work on this as well. We're keen to learn from others. We've been in touch with various groups in Australia through a FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency Wildland Firefighting Cancer Study. And there's also always innovations on the market. So we would love there to be something that is NFPA certified, NFPA 1984 certified. And this year is really about learning what we've learned over the last few years, applying it as best as we think possible, seeing how that goes and seeing what could change moving forward. Very briefly, there's a number of other research projects that we're involved in that I won't get too much into detail that Drew and others are playing a big role on. Things like a visual smoke guide, carbon monoxide risk assessment, hand-arm vibration, which Drew will talk a little bit about, the use of wearable air monitors, and supporting the BC Wildfire Service's knowledge of non-vegetative exposures. We're also gearing up to partner with UBC on a new suite of research that looks at cardiorespiratory health impacts of wildland firefighters. The previous work, was more respiratory and dermal focused. We really haven't done work on the heart, and there is a knowledge gap there generally. So looking forward to that starting here this fire season, hopefully before this fire season. And lastly, just want to mention that we're really looking forward to working with Health Canada, and really looking forward to working with them more on the national frame on things that would contribute to the national framework on cancer and firefighters, and working towards some data collection with BC Wildfire Service crews that's going to help address some of those gaps. So those that were here last time would have heard from Dr. Paul White, and really looking forward to collaborating with him. And also using the mobile lab that we're leasing from the University of Alberta. So thank you, folks at Canada Wildfire, that have helped with that. I think I'm going to not touch on this slide because I'm a bit over time, but if people are, and I'm not sure who's exactly in the audience, but I'd say we've learned a lot over the last 5 years about the challenges of conducting research that needs to be integrated with operations and integrated on the fire line. And I'm happy to talk about that with anyone that is in a similar position, because it is a challenge, especially in the kind of fire seasons that we've had in BC over the last few years. And I want to just end by really just taking a really quick moment to acknowledge that I'm really grateful to be in the position that I'm in, and to be able to be joined by so many other people in the BC Wildfire Service working on topics related to health of wildland firefighters. When Karen approached me about Flare Up February and could I talk about what's happening in the BC Wildfire Service, I thought, yes, I could, but I think the amazing strength of the BC Wildfire Service is the depth and breadth of experience we have in health research and other health related topics that are outside of research. And I was really keen to showcase some of those folks. So I'm really happy that they agreed to join. There's always, of course, work to be done, and things that we want to move forward on and improve on. But I'm really proud of some of the work that we're doing, and I'm really happy that we're going to be able to talk more about that here today. So without further ado, I know we're a bit over time here. I will turn it over to Drew for the next presentation. Drew, if you're ready.
Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Perfect. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Drew Lichty. I am an occupational hygienist here at Canada Wildfire. But in my day-to-day operations, I work within the research and innovation business area at BC Wildfire Service. I'm super excited to be part of this panel today. We're so lucky to have so many really interesting topics and individuals speaking. So I'll just kind of get right into it to keep things rolling along. I will focus today on some respiratory hazards on the wildland fire line and what you might be exposed to. Natasha gave a really great overview of some of the work that BC Wildfire has been doing in the last few years. But basically, my hope here is to take a step back, contextualize what the exposures are, and why that work we did is so important. So wildland firefighters are exposed to a variety of toxic exposures, from wildfire smoke itself, the ash and dust that's kicked up when you're hiking, dry mopping, etc., and also engine exhaust from chainsaws, pumps, and vehicles. And these exposures exist as a highly complex mixture of particulates and gases. And when we talk about air pollution, those are kind of the two domains of what you can be exposed to, and they have implications for the types of respirators and some other control measures. Many of the exposures on the fire line are carcinogenic. Therefore, there's no safe level of exposure. We can't assume that you can be exposed to a carcinogen and not have, a associated increase in your potential risk to develop that cancer. On the fire line, you're exposed to literally hundreds of compounds. Some of these are known and regulated and have known health effects, and others are unknown with unknown health effects and aren't regulated. So I will briefly go over just a couple of the key concerns in wildfire smoke. again, this is just a very, very brief high-level overview, just in the sake of time. But I'm really happy to be presenting to such a focused group on wildland fire personnel, and I hope that some of this can supplement or answer questions of what you were wondering you were exposed to. So probably the chief component in wildfire smoke and kind of all ambient air particulate, which is why I have a picture of like car exhaust there, for example, is this fine particulate matter. And wildfire smoke particulate matter is incredibly small. And that means it can get into your lungs all the way down to where the gas exchange occurs with your blood. And the particulates can stay in your lungs, they'll cause local damage and inflammation, and also translocate into your blood and pretty much go to any organ in the body. And exposure to fine particulate matter has been implicated in a wide variety of systemic adverse health effects, from causing lung cancer, respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, stroke, low birth weight in fetuses, etc. Next, we have polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which Natasha touched on, and I'll be very brief. We also call them PAHs. Occupational exposure to PAHs is associated with lung, skin, and bladder cancer, and most recently in the IARC ruling for firefighting, bladder cancer is kind of the main concern. Carbon monoxide is a colorless, odorless gas. In moderate and short-term or chronic exposure, it can mimic effects of heat stress, dehydration, and fatigue by causing nausea, dizziness, headache. In higher exposure scenarios, which someone might not be removed from, this can actually result in collapse, permanent brain and heart injury, and even death. The next three exposures on this list are all gases, so formaldehyde, benzene, and acrolein. These are all nose, eye, and throat irritants, and formaldehyde is a confirmed carcinogen causing upper respiratory tract cancer. Benzene causes leukemia, and acrolein is a suspected respiratory carcinogen. And again, I just wanted to reiterate that there's so much more in wildfire smoke. There's hundreds of compounds, and these are just some of the few ones that we were most concerned about. So when we think about reducing exposure to wildfire smoke, I have two slides on this. The first is sort of like operational considerations, and some of these are more feasible than others. I don't come from fire. I don't have experience on a crew or anything like that. I'm mostly here just summarizing what literature and industry recommends and identifies as high-risk scenarios. So the first point on this slide is creating a visual smoke guide, which is something that BC Wildfire Service has actually started to take steps towards trying to do. And what this would basically look like is having pictures or maybe even video of smoky areas on the fire line. And next to that picture, we would have, if it looks like this, you're likely exposed to this level of carbon monoxide, this level of particulate matter, and here are our recommendations. Whether that's rotating out of that area after an hour or putting on a respirator, things like that. We want to help guide our staff to make decisions in the field around their exposure, because it can be very tough to understand what is and what isn't a healthy situation on a dynamic fire line. Some other ways we can reduce exposure is limiting mop-up. So there really needs to be a shift towards looking at mop-up as a hazardous activity in and of itself. And it should just be, the right tool for the right time and the right reason. We should not be mopping up excessively if it doesn't have any benefits to securing the fire line, because this exposes our crew to, smoke, to ash and dust. We want to look to rotate workers and crews out of heavy smoke areas, such as when they're holding line. Emphasize the use of roads and natural features in fire lines, alter line locations to reduce smoke exposure, use flanking attacks, monitor forecasts for smoke and inversions, and increase the use of bucketing, sprinklers, and retardant. Some other ways we can reduce smoke that's not necessarily changing operationally how we fight fire are training firefighters on hazards of smoke exposure. It is very shocking to me when talking to a lot of folks around the world, honestly, internationally, of just how little training and education and awareness there is for hazards and on the fire line and what they're actually being exposed to. There is a huge prevalence of, wildfire smoke is natural and therefore it's fine. It's just campfire smoke. It's not going to hurt you, etc. So training firefighters and being able to have them, contextualize their smoke exposure will go a very long way to helping reduce exposures. We also want to look into tracking exposure, both the degree and frequency. So we actually know what proportion on any given fire season our staff are exposed to what they might call like a heavy smoke exposure day or a light smoke exposure day or no smoke exposure at all. We want to look to locating fire camps in areas that won't be prone to inversions. This is really important because there's many situations in which a crew might be exposed to wildfire smoke pretty much on a 24/7 basis, which can provide a baseline of exposure that might put them at a risk of being overexposed compared to some occupational exposure limits without taking into account any of the actual work duties, just existing in that area alone. We want to provide respirators as a tool for reducing exposure in some of these unavoidable circumstances where other control measures aren't feasible. We want to be monitoring air quality at camps and implement further controls under inversion conditions. So this could look like, putting out some N95s for people to wear at camp, or looking into getting some clean air shelters or something like that. And then also there's a need to develop wildfire-specific exposure limits and develop medical surveillance programs that actually track some of the health outcomes of our staff over repeated seasons. So another main inhalation hazard on the fire line is ash and dust. You see some familiar hazards here. So we have fine particulate matter and we have PAHs as well, particularly with ash. But when we're talking about dust from the earth and soil, crystalline silica becomes a concern. Silica is a very tightly regulated hazard in pretty much all jurisdictions in Canada. It can cause a very debilitating disease called silicosis, which is a permanent and irreversible lung disease that causes, a persistent cough, shortness of breath, fatigue, and weakness. And it also can cause lung cancer. Construction industries have been battling silica exposure for a long time, and they go through great pains to reduce exposure as much as they can. I have a picture of someone cutting concrete there. Any sort of cutting, polishing of concrete, engineered stone, tile, things like that can expose you to silica. On the fire line, I have some pictures here. Patrolling, hiking, mop up, cold trailing, and digging guard. Anything that really disperses that fine soil in the air can expose you to silica. When we want to reduce exposure, again, we're looking at limiting mop-up where feasible, because that's going to expose you to that ash and dust. We want to limit line construction by relying on roads and terrain, maybe increasing spacing between workers when constructing that hairline, so you're not breathing in everyone else's dust that they're dispersing into the air. Wetting down soils before disturbing them where feasible. So this could be on the fire line if you have a water source within reach, but also on forest service roads and at the fire camps themselves, which can get incredibly dusty. And again, this is a good opportunity to provide respirators as one tool for reducing exposure in these unavoidable circumstances. The last kind of inhalation hazard I'll talk about here is carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide, like I mentioned earlier, it's colorless, it's odorless, it's tasteless. You won't necessarily know you're being exposed to it. And it's present in both wildfire smoke and engine exhaust. And what's unique about carbon monoxide is that it poses like an acute safety hazard on the fire line, where most of these other hazards we're talking about are implicated in long-term latent effects and diseases you might get later in life. Whereas carbon monoxide can really put you at risk, on the day on the fire line. And this is because it displaces oxygen in your blood, basically mimicking the effects of hypoxia. Short-term and kind of moderate to low exposures overlap with heat stress, fatigue symptoms, and longer-term exposures and high concentrations can lead to collapse, death, and permanent brain injury. Probably the most important piece of information in my presentation that I'd like to get across is that no respirator other than a self-contained breathing apparatus, which is not feasible for the fire line, and I don't need to get into reasons why for this audience, because but no other respirator will protect against the effects of carbon monoxide. The gas will go right through any filter and into your bloodstream like you weren't wearing anything at all. So how can we reduce exposure? We want to look to implement all previous controls mentioned for wildfire smoke, because it is a major component of wildfire smoke, obviously not including respirators here. But looking at small engines and the exhaust fumes, we want to rotate Sawyers to ideally less than 3 hours per day, especially if operating in smoky conditions. Now, I know that 3 hours a day can sound like a bit unfeasible or far-fetched, especially because we often have Sawyers who are working 8 to 10 hours in a day. But this is definitely a goal and a target that should be strived for. If we have certified Sawyers that we can rotate tasks around, it's probably a good thing to get them to have some trigger time to get some experience on the saw anyway. And I can't stress enough that if we are already in a situation like an inversion or an area that is very socked in, you may be exposed to carbon monoxide above the exposure limit without any additional exposure. So in these situations, we really want to be looking to limiting our use on the saw whenever feasible. There's some engineering controls as well that we can use. So maintaining saw filters, keeping them clean, making sure you're using properly mixed fuels, and considering using alkylate fuels where feasible. This is a bit more expensive. You can't get it from the gas station, but there's a significant reduction in carbon monoxide and other hazardous emissions in the fumes when you use these types of fuels. The pump is also a very significant source of carbon monoxide. It's a bit different in that than chainsaws and wildfire smoke. It's in that it's completely stationary, so it's a bit more feasible to work around this exposure. And we can implement safe work practices for pump operations to do this. So first and foremost, we want to actually have our staff look at the pump as a hazard that can result in extremely high levels of carbon monoxide. We want to have them locating these pumps in areas with adequate ventilation and have them not obstruct the pump exhaust. So if you see on these pictures here, there's a little gray arrow that's sort of highlighting the direction of the exhaust that the pump shoots out. And if that's not obstructed, what you see here, these numbers are carbon monoxide monitors. And they've been averaged out to 15 minutes. And in the direction of the exhaust, you see in this area across the creek, a area of a concentration of about 350 parts per million. To put that number in context, the short-term exposure limit, which is you can kind of be exposed to like for 15 minutes, is 100 parts per million. And this is incredibly high. And if you have an individual like pump operators often are, who is injured, recovering, or fatigued, and they sit down and don't realize they're in that area of high concentration because it's odorless and invisible and tasteless, you start to get into the realm of concentrations that can cause, collapse and permanent injury. On the bottom picture, we basically simulated the obstruction of the exhaust from a bladder. We used a table that was like waist height. I didn't have a picture, so I drew one in here. And what we see here is when you have something obstruct the exhaust, it sort of rebounds back onto the pump site. And you can see on these numbers here, all of these carbon monoxide monitors increased to levels sometimes almost twice that exposure limit for short-term exposures. And so that's when we start to get worried about how long an individual is directly operating the pump, troubleshooting it, etc. So the last few slides in my presentation, I'll just kind of focus on respiratory protection and the way we view it and some of the limitations. So first and foremost, we really want to stress that a respirator on the fire line must be certified by NIOSH, which is the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. There is so many masks out there that are marketed to wildland firefighting that are very similar in practice to a bandana. There's also lots of bandanas out there and that are just not a feasible option for respirators in a workplace. Ideally, we would be able to find a respirator that is certified to NFPA 1984, as Natasha mentioned, but nothing exists right now. The NFPA 1984 standard basically takes the NIOSH certification and builds on it with things like durability, heat resistance, and flammability resistance. We really want to look at respirators as one tool that is available for exposure reduction, and these have many significant and important limitations. So they are often kind of the last case scenario when we have exhausted every other type of control, which you can see on this kind of hierarchy of control. PPE is at the bottom, which is the least effective. So I'll really briefly just kind of contextualize how respirators are used on the fire line. This data comes from a survey that Natasha mentioned that we gave out in the summer of 2023. And what we really found was that individuals, when they were given a respirator and completely up to them, and it was completely discretionary use, they wore it for about 15 to 30 minutes at a time, 2 to 3 times a day for a total of like 1 to 2 hours. And this is a really important point to stress, because a lot of people will see a respirator and their first reaction to it is like, I can't wear that for a full 16-hour shift. Or, I can't wear that hiking uphill for 45 minutes straight. And absolutely not, you shouldn't. That in and of itself creates a significant health and safety hazard. And we want to stress that if you're given this as a tool, if it's in your pack and you can reach for it when you choose, you actually are able to kind of target those higher exposure times and put them on only when it really makes sense to put them on. Most often we see people wearing them during wet and dry mopping. I won't go through all of these, but essentially, pretty positive responses if the work was short-term or lightweight, and negative responses if they're for any sort of communication, sort of like in radio or in person. And 100% of the respondents agreed that respiratory protection should be implemented within BC Wildfire Service on a non-mandatory basis. And then my last couple slides here are just going to focus on the limitations here of respirators, because they're so important to get across. And if any jurisdiction is considering implementing respirators, these are kind of the messages that we think need to be highlighted and made sure that they are transferred to our crews. So again, just wanting to reiterate this point that respirators do not protect against carbon monoxide, and the effects of carbon monoxide exposure can be deadly. Any interference between the skin and the face piece will reduce the overall effectiveness, and this includes facial hair. We are not at a point where we're recommending that there is a clean shaven policy, because that is not feasible for a number of reasons out on the Wildland Fireline. But people should know that facial hair, jewelry, hair from your head, even anything that comes into contact between the face piece and the skin will dramatically reduce the effectiveness. Respirators, again, are not an ideal situation because of just environmental and work conditions. Overall, this will reduce respirator use on the fire line, and in some situations that they will be entirely unfeasible due to very high work rates and very hot environments. And importantly, respirators may result in an individual putting themselves in a high exposure scenario for longer than they otherwise would. And this is because they don't have that sort of feedback mechanism of a cough, of throat irritation, etc. That would, otherwise say, okay, it's time to leave this area. And that brings me to my final point, which is the situation of using a respirator on the fire line in a situation that might be immediately dangerous to life and health. So the way that we want to contextualize respirators for our staff is that they are a tool that will reduce sort of what we call like baseline cumulative exposures to chronic long-term health risks during normal operation of the fire line. If you wear this respirator kind of as much as you can, you will reduce your exposure to particulate matter, to some gases, to things that cause cancer, respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, things like that. We don't want our staff to look at a respirator and see it as a tool for extreme short-term smoke situations that makes it now okay to go in these situations where they otherwise would never. So I'm thinking of a situation on the fire line where there might be a spot fire that flares up. There's thick smoke. You can't even see across it. And someone puts their respirator on, just kind of lets their head and just trudges into it. That is the exact opposite of what we want to see. And that can actually have catastrophic consequences is if this is how our staff view respirators and kind of their role on the fire line. And again, this is because the respirator will not protect you against carbon monoxide. In these incredibly high concentration scenarios, those interferences in the face seal become even more important as those particulates and those gases start to infiltrate in higher quantities. So we really wanted to stress that this is a tool for reducing your cumulative long-term chronic exposure and not one for extremely high short-term scenarios. And then this picture on the slide here, I'm not sure how well it shows up, but this is sort of illustrating one of those scenarios. And we have an individual, there's actually kind of a silhouette there of him in a very, very smoky situation. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation here. I'm happy to answer any questions sort of at the end of the presentation. Just throw them in the chat if you have any questions about respiratory hazards and or anything maybe I didn't touch on. So thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks, Drew. I'll just pull up my slides here. Drew, can you see that? Nice. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Jesse Wallace-Webb. I've been working with BC Wildfire on the crew side since 2016, mostly as an initial attack crew leader. And right now I'm working with Natasha and Drew in the research and innovation business area as a seasonal research analyst. Like Natasha mentioned, I'm talking to you today from Victoria. So would like to acknowledge the Lekwungen peoples whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, as well as the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Osinius peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about my master's study that focused on the interrelationships between sleep, shift length, stress, and brain function in wildland firefighters. This will just be sort of a taster today. I won't be going through all of my study findings, but if this topic is of interest to you, then know that I am planning to do a full-length webinar with Canada Wildfire sometime in May, and we'll be going into more detail then. So keep an eye out for that. So to start with just a bit of background, you all know that wildfires worldwide are tending to get worse and worse year after year, and this translates to higher demands on wildland firefighters whose health and safety are really critical for protecting communities. I can tell you from my experience on the line that firefighting does involve being exposed at times to some harsh working conditions, including smoke exposure, like Drew talked about, long shift durations, suboptimal sleep, and periods of heightened emotional stress. Unfortunately, exposure to all of these stressors have been linked to a wide array of negative health and safety related outcomes, but unfortunately, there remains to be a lack of research outside of traditional shift work settings. So how did I address this gap in the literature? The objective of my study was to examine the potential cognitive and stress-related impacts of both poor sleep and long shifts within the context of wildland firefighting. I approached this with two research questions, the first being just are measures of stress or brain function associated with sleep and or shift characteristics. My second question, which I'm not going to get into today, was whether participant factors like age, experience, and biological sex influenced any of these relationships that were identified in the first question. And my goal for this project was really to provide insight and recommendations towards improved fatigue management policy within BCWS. So to address these questions, I ran a completely remote observational within subject study on 25 firefighters from the BC Wildfire Service. Collection ran in two phases, first as a pilot study in 2021, and then again, full collection in 2022. Participants were recruited from across the province using both random and convenience sampling methods. Again, all data collection was completely remote and self-administered. So this meant that we shipped equipment directly to people's homes and then provided virtual training on the collection procedures. Briefly, this entailed a heart rate recording in the morning and evening, as well as some collection at the start and end of their shift. In terms of frequency, participants were asked to collect data once every few days when on fires, as well as on the first day following their subsequent days off. This went on for 2 to 3 months, starting in July, both years in 2022 or 2021 and 2022, which both years was really when the core fire season really began here in BC. So just in terms of my measures, as I mentioned, a day of collection began and ended with a 10-minute heart rate recording. This is while participants were laying in bed. From this, we measured both heart rate and heart rate variability using the polar chest and wrist monitors. In the results, you'll see R to R interval listed instead of heart rate. Just know that they're directly inversely related to each other, so I use the two terms somewhat interchangeably. Using the same wristwatch, I was also able to record participants' sleep every night, and using the Polar software, I extracted 12 different sleep metrics, including those related to sleep duration, quality, as well as timing. And then at the start and end of shift, participants completed a short survey and cognitive task. Both of those were done on people's smartphones. So the daily surveys measured subjective levels of stress and fatigue, as well as shift information. And these were done using the SurveyMonkey app when participants were in self-service, and when they were out of service, then using a physical form. Brain function was assessed using a 3-minute reaction time test called the psychomotor vigilance task, otherwise known as PVT. And the outcome measure I looked at for this was mainly just average response time, as well as number of lapses in attention, lapses of attention being defined by response times over 355 milliseconds. At times during this presentation, I'll use the term fatigue interchangeably with brain function. So if you hear me say fatigue, think reduced brain function. For my data analysis, I used an all too complicated technique called linear mixed effects modeling. I'll save you the agony of going into the details here, but essentially what I did was I used a reverse elimination process to determine which sleep and shift characteristics were the most predictive of stress and fatigue. And then instead of pooling everybody into the same data set, I used separate lines of association to basically control for individual differences between people. Okay, so now in terms of results, what did I find? Well, to start, it was apparent that firefighters were routinely working long shifts and were not receiving adequate sleep on fire suppression days. So average suppression shift durations were nearly 14 hours long, with 90% being recorded as over 12 hours. And average sleep duration on fire suppression days were 6.7 hours, with 70% being less than the recommended 7 hours of sleep. For the results pertaining to my questions, I've broken it up into the 4 different relationships. So to start, the relationship between sleep and stress. Here, polar sleep score, which is a composite of both quantity and quality metrics, was found to be the best predictor of both subjective stress and morning heart rate. Again, shown here as R-to-R interval, while evening bedtime was the best predictor of heart rate variability. Again, what we're looking at in these figures are separate lines of association that are combined to assess the overall strength of relationship between 2 variables. So you can see that worse sleep was associated with both higher levels of subjective stress and increased heart rate, while later bedtimes were associated with reduced heart rate variability. You may know that heart rate and heart rate variability broadly reflect the balance between the 2 branches of our nervous system. So when we get stressed, our sympathetic or fight or flight system takes over. And this leads to increased heart rate and decreased heart rate variability. Whereas when we're in a more relaxed state, our parasympathetic or rest and digest system takes over, and this leads to lower heart rate, but increased heart rate variability. So the takeaway here is that insufficient sleep between shifts was directly related to higher levels of stress. Now, the relationship between sleep and fatigue, again, fatigue being synonymous with reduced brain function. Here, sleep score was found to be the best predictor for all measures. So you can see that sleep score was negatively associated with increased levels of subjective fatigue, slower response times, and increased number of attentional lapses. So again, the takeaway here, simply put, is that poor sleep was directly related to impaired brain function. Now, the relationship with shift characteristics, I've grouped both stress and fatigue into one. So looking at stress variables on the right, we can see that shift duration was found to be the best predictor for all measures and was positively related to both increased subjective stress and higher evening heart rate. But there were no shift characteristics that significantly predicted heart rate variability. It's worth pointing out that the levels of stress were also found to be higher after shift compared to before shift. For all the measures, And this pre to post difference increased with increasing shift durations. The relationship between shift and fatigue tells a similar story. So here, shift duration was found to be the best predictor of and was positively related to all the measures, including increased subjective fatigue, slower response times, and increased number of attentional lapses. Again, brain function was found to be lower after shift compared to before shift across all the metrics, and this trend increased with longer shifts. So the takeaway here is that long shifts were related to both reduced brain function and increased levels of stress. So to summarize, pretty much all the findings point in the same direction, being that long shifts and poor sleep were directly related to increased levels of stress and impaired brain function. This was true across all the measures, the only exception being that heart rate variability was not associated with any shift characteristics, and HRV was also associated with evening bedtime rather than overall sleep score. Now, these findings become concerning in light of the fact that poor sleep and long shifts were not the exception on fire suppression days. They were really the norm. But just because they become normalized does not subtract from the implications to worker health and safety. So fatigue-related cognitive impairment does directly increase the risk of workplace accidents and injuries in several ways, including through reduced awareness and poor judgment. Meanwhile, long-term exposure to stress causes excessive wear and tear on bodily systems, which has been linked to a wide array of negative health outcomes, including an increased risk of developing diseases. With this, my findings point towards several recommendations that could be taken by BCWS to improve worker health and safety. I'll resist going too far into the weeds here, but in general, I believe that we should be exploring the utility of potential stress and fatigue interventions, in addition to continuous improvement to our hours of work policies. I'll leave it there in the interest of time and hand it off to Jeremy, but if anybody has any questions or anything, please do feel free to reach out. Here are my references, which would be more than happy to share if you guys want to see later on. And here's my contact info. So I'll figure out how to stop there and pass it to you, Jeremy. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jesse. I'm just going to share my screen, everyone. All right, morning. My name is Jeremy Angus. I'm a Senior Wildfire Officer of Operations for the southeast corner of BC, and I'm also a PhD student at the University of Victoria. And my research is a little bit related with Jesse's, but also a little bit differently. So I'm looking at the impacts of injuries or the characteristics of injuries on the severity of an injury among firefighters. I did an exploratory study during the 2021 season looking at, we'll get into it. So I'm not going to talk too much about this. It's the same as what Jesse was talking about. Fire seasons are getting worse. There's increased wildland urban interface. These are creating higher stakes and increasing the severity of injuries for firefighters out there. And there's really a gap in understanding of how injury characteristics relate to injury severity. The purpose of my study was to examine the association between injury characteristics and injury severity among Canadian wildland firefighters during the 2021 fire season. To do this, I looked at BCWS's Occupational Health and Safety Incident Tracking Database. There were 278 injury reports for the 2021 season. I used a multilinear regression analysis, and I evaluated the influence of 10 different predictors on the severity of injury, and how I'm defining the severity of injury as the number of days off following the injury. So the predictors that I looked at were age, sex, years of experience, the position that they held, so like a crew leader or a crew member or a fire officer, the assignment, so were they on the fire line or were they back at the base, the activities that they were doing, digging, walking, so forth, the location of the injury on the body, the type of injury, so was it a sprain or a strain, or a cut, stuff like that, what caused the injury, and did it result in time loss. Of the 278 injuries, the highest frequency were as follows. So most to the lumbar region, followed by hand or wrist, ankle and foot, the knee, and overall the regression analysis was statistically significant. So meaning that there is that the characteristics do indicate that do show you whether an injury is going to be more severe or not. Of the 10 predictors, the ones that were the most significant was the location of injury, so where it is on your body, and if it occurred in time loss. The other factors like age, gender, years of experience did not significantly affect the severity of injury. The location of injury is an essential factor in predicting the severity. And so in that vein, intervention strategies should focus on reducing. We're finding that the location that is most likely to lead to long-term injury is the lower back. So intervention strategies should focus on core stability while improving hip and thoracic mobility to reduce this injury potential. And I think wildland firefighting organizations should focus on education programs and correct biomechanical movement pattern education. So like how to bend over and pick things up correctly. And I think these types of programs could significantly impact injury prevention and injury severity for wildland firefighters. And we're doing questions at the end, so I'll turn it over to the next person.
Thanks, Jeremy. That's me. I'll just get the slideshow rolling here and share screen. By here, just having some difficulties finding the share screen. Again, there we are. Yeah. Perfect. Can folks see my screen there?
Yep, looks great.
Good.
Awesome, thank you. Just getting this all need to go here. Sorry about this. So what I want to talk about briefly here is just about some of the actual tangible things that are being done to support wild firefighter mental health. And I come from a background of as a wildland firefighter, moving through the unit crew program, and now I've sort of moved up in various different positions around British Columbia, and I'm now a wildfire technician in Revelstoke, British Columbia. This is the lands of the traditional lands of the Secwepemc, Sinixt, Silks, and Ktunaxa First Nations, and yeah, grateful to be a unwelcome settler on this land. So the from what I've heard from everyone else here is and it really has me really excited about all the things that we're doing as a collective in BC Wildfire to research and look into the things that might harm us. And one of the things that we haven't spoken about yet, but we are certainly thinking about is the psychological impacts of the work that we all do. So there's a couple of things that we are doing that I'm involved with, and I'm really proud of, and have started being championing within BC, but also nationally as well. And that's why I'm here talking to you now. My background doesn't come from research. It comes from boots on the ground firefighting, as does many other people, but I don't have a research background. And I think it's important to mention that, because when I think about what it is that wildland firefighters need, is the outcomes that everybody on this call is trying to produce. And that is like tangible tools. I often refer to the work that I do is like harvesting tools that we can use, like a Pulaski. You know, like a Pulaski is a basic, useful tool. A lot of us are really like oriented in like what can help in a difficult situation, in challenging situations. And I think there's a lot of nebulous things out there, a lot of nebulous liabilities out there in terms of impacting our mental health. And I think that we're taking big steps towards moving the dial in the right direction. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is something that through the Ministry of Forest, the BC Wildfire Service has employed since 1991. There was a series of pretty severe accidents, and they realized that there's something that we needed to do to support our staff. So we explored and have built a team of 19 volunteer peers that respond with a independent model called it's the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation model for debriefing and diffusing. And we've adopted that, built this team, and now whenever there is a critical incident, then people call a line. It actually routes through our same line that you would call to call in a wildfire. That those dispatchers pass it along to the CISM dispatchers, and then we dispatch a team or provide information as needed. So the idea with that is, and the analogy that I've made a few times, is it's very similar to that level 3 first aid attendant, or that first aid attendant that would be out in the fire line. The job is to really assess, find out what's happening, do any kind of interventions that we can to facilitate the body's own natural healing. So the analogy I often use is a cut across the hand. So, you know, if you had a cut across the hand, it would be your job as a first aid attendant to be able to say, well, that is beyond my capacity to be able to deal with. I'm going to refer you immediately to medical aid, and we'll get you there as soon as possible. Package that up and head you in the right direction. If it's a minor cut, then what we can do is we can irrigate that wound. We can provide some, bandages and whatnot, and then we can kind of check back on consistent intervals to make sure that your body is doing its own natural healing. I think there's an analogous process with your mind and your heart, and that's what the CISM debriefings, diffusings, the interventions that our team does do. They really just facilitate your body's own and your mind's own natural trend towards healing. So we have, we respond to hundreds of people each year. That is everything from having one-on-one connections all the way up through to group interventions with up to about 20 people. So we are just trained peers with a specialized skill set that we have been training over years and years. We have constant education happening. And we just have that ability to be able to refer to our own employee and family assistance program and any other resources that we know of in the community. So we are sort of, we provide education and awareness around psychological health and safety and around the existence of the program. We provide these interventions, and then we provide follow-up as well. So those are kind of the primary things that the CISM program does, and it allows us to really highlight a lot of the good work that many of the other people are doing within the safety and well-being part of BC Wildfire. So I've been privileged to be a part of the team for 12 years now, 13 years now, and I have seen the real life benefits of this program in play, and it's been profound. So the benefit of that and the benefit of the CISM program is that it allows us to respond when something happens, and there's nobody here on this call that's immune to a critical incident. It could be anything from a workplace fatality to an accident to a near miss to a mission failure. There's all these sort of broad range of things that we could be exposed to, whether that's through work or even just on your way to work. Those are all things that can impact us and create a big challenge. And I guess the CISM program is a way for BC Wildfire Service and the Ministry of Forests overall to say, hey, we've got you. Don't worry about it. You're taken care of. Where there's services here to support, specifically with the CISM team, but then also that's sort of the link into all the other services that are available. That's reactively, and I think that that begs the question that if there's these potential liabilities out there, our safety regulatory body, WorkSafe BC, will say, hey, if you notice and you reasonably anticipate that there is going to be a hazard, then you need to provide some sort of steps, to put in play to make sure that you're avoiding that hazard, or that you've got steps to either avoid or mitigate the harms from that hazard. So one of the things that we've done among a bunch of other programs and steps, but the one that I'm sort of mostly deeply involved with would be resilient mines. So in 2018, the Steve Lemon reached out to Canadian Mental Health Association, and we picked up this program called Resilient Mines, which was developed for structural firefighters. And it's really, like I mentioned at the beginning of the time here, is like hard, tangible skills for people that need practical psychological support. So I think I've just been talking and totally missing my slides as I go along here. So critical incident, I think I spoke to that just briefly. That's the team webpage. And then this is the title page for the Resilient Minds program. So basically it's a 4-part program. We've delivered it over 1,000 times now within BC Wildfire. We've done 3 train the trainer sessions where we have now probably about 20 active trainers that can go out and deliver this program throughout BC Wildfire. It's broken up into 4 programs. So the first one is essentially an awareness around trauma, an awareness around the impacts, the fact that 1 in 5 people in Canada has struggles with mental health. Those are really important things to be able to recognize, because as you're sort of surveying the context of the humans that you work with, you have to realize what, again, are the harms, and then the program sort of sets in play what are the things you can do about it. So the second part of the second module of Resilient Minds is supporting peers with the 4R toolkit. So it's essentially, how do you help your peers? And this 4R toolkit is a really concrete tool that's easy to remember and allows you to not be caught flat-footed in a challenging situation with peers. If somebody said, hey, I'm considering suicide, if that question was posed to you right now, how do you respond? And do you have the tools to do that? Well, Resilient Minds provides a format to be able to do that. So I think that's super awesome. The next thing is, of course, with Wildland Firework, we reach out and we are working with the public quite often. So then we move into how do you work with people that are struggling in the public, and then ultimately we take that same model and bring it back to managing your own stress. So you're sort of taking the model to your friends, to the people you work with in the community and outside BC Wildfire, and then back to yourself. How do you apply these same rules and tools to yourself? So it's an awesome program. We have taken it from the structural version, adapted it for the wildland environment, and now have delivered training for Parks Canada as well. There's been folks from Alberta and Ontario that have also taken the course as well, and looking at some deliveries in the spring for potentially Ontario, the Yukon, and Alberta. And so the CISM program provides hard response tools for difficult situations, and also allows us to highlight a bunch of other things a bunch of other supports that are available as well. Resilient Minds sort of has that proactive ability to be able to prime people for difficult situations that we know are inevitable in the work that we encounter, and gives them hard tools that they can use to make it happen. So That's kind of those are the two programs that I'm involved in and passionate about. I am really keen to chat with anybody. If anyone has any questions, if you want to know any more information, how to get any of these programs fired up in your own jurisdictions, please don't hesitate to reach out. And again, thanks for giving me a few minutes among these research giants to be able to talk about some of these really concrete hard tools that are already being put in play. Thanks. I'll turn it over to the next person, I believe, Steve.
Thanks, Eric. Great primer there. Really demonstrated some of those tools that we're putting into play to help resolve some of the issues that we're experiencing around mental health in the workplace. And one of the things that I will continually celebrate in BC right now is kind of our remarkable progress in this field. Really, prior to 2019, we had two catastrophic fire seasons. 17 and 18 were both very, very large fire seasons, and sort of coming out of the end of those seasons, we realized that our staff were struggling and that people were having a hard time returning to what would be considered a normal life. That previously, we hadn't really considered that wildfire fighters could be exposed to post-traumatic stress. And following those two very large seasons, two very catastrophic fire seasons, we saw the impact in our staff and started looking and researching and considering how we can do better, how we can treat people in a different way. And so, as Eric kind of illustrated, the CISM program has been around for a little while, for sure. And as a response mechanism to stressful encounters or traumatic encounters. And then, 2019, we started exploring the possibility of this Resilient Minds course so that we could start putting some training in place, preparing people for the work that we expect of them. Along that journey, we've discovered a few other things, and one of the things that I'm really excited about now is that we're, as an agency, BC Wildfire has committed towards moving towards adopting the national standard for psychological health and safety in the workplace. This is a broad-reaching initiative sponsored by the Mental Health Commission of Canada, and really with the intent of looking further upstream, looking at the organizational factors, looking at the workplace environment, that we may be able to start putting mitigating factors in improving the work environment so that we're reducing the impact of stress in the workplace. One of the things that we've learned for sure is that the stress in the workplace is not just related to fireline response. It's also related to organizational structure and pay grids and workload management and work-life management and all of these other factors. And I think it's a really important acknowledgement that we're not just dealing with a bunch of firefighters and dispatchers and finance people and management and support mechanisms. We're also dealing with family people, and we're dealing with fathers and sons and husbands and wives and all of the other, so we really want to incorporate this notion that we're bringing whole people to work and returning whole people from work back to their families. So we've started down the road of applying the national standard. If you haven't heard of this, it's a set of guidelines, tools, and resources focused on promoting employees' psychological health and preventing psychological harm due to workplace factors. So it really delves into the psychosocial factors that impact well-being and kind of breaks that down into a number of different categories. I think it's important to acknowledge that it's voluntary. There's no obligation for any agency or us to go down this road. It's aligned to existing standards and rules, so we really want to sort of work within the context we have, improve what we can. It's applicable across the board. Any organization can pick this up and learn from it and work with it. and it's sort of built to measure progress. And I think one of the really important and kind of neat factors about the national standard is it's actually very difficult to achieve kind of like the gold standard, right? Because it is an iterative process, and we're always going to be learning and moving through and gaining different insights, changing workplace practices, changing workplace policies and procedures. So it'll always be a learning curve rather than sort of a, we've reached the goal, we can all put our hands back and celebrate. So last year or 2 years ago, we conducted sort of the first stage of the national standard, which was completing an internal audit. We asked some very hard questions to our staff, of our leadership, how they were feeling, how they were responding to workplace. We broke it down into these 13 psychosocial factors, and some of the things that we realized. Probably not a surprise to this group, but probably there is that. Yes, indeed, people are struggling with the work that we asked them to do. Some of the things that we saw really clear from the upstream perspective is, we definitely had some issues around leadership, some change management systems in place that people were having a hard time adapting to. Workload management was one of the ones that became very clear that that we've got some work to do on, for sure. Even things as simple as confidentiality and data collection. Going through this audit process sort of allowed us to recognize some of those areas of deficit that may not seem important at first, but that do have a big impact on workers' well-being and mental health in the long run. And just recently, so as part of our progress towards adopting this national standard, we've together a wildfire mental health leadership team. This consists of several members of our executive, sort of our highest level decision makers, right down to some of the people who are really like some of the workers who are really engaged in implementing some of these things, and several of the people on this call are part of that group. And so we're really looking at long-term strategies as to how we can improve the workplace to prevent or mitigate the effects of mental health and mental challenges in this workplace. One of the, just sort of on a secondary topic, and one of the things I just wanted to highlight, obviously last year, BC Wildfire had a very, very challenging season. We saw fireline fatalities for really one of the first times in our known history. There has been other fatalities, but really this year brought it home to us, very real, with some of our own workers succumbing to their injuries. So one of the things that we did, which was very unique this year, is that we put on a trauma recovery group. So we took advantage of an organization called the Honor Ranch, which is a group of military veterans, RCMP veterans, structural firefighters, that have an organization called the Honor Ranch or the Honor House. They've got an amazing facility out in the wilderness, beautiful scenic location, and they offered their facility to us for free, and we put on a 3-day trauma recovery group. We hired a number of counselors and therapists, a number of physical therapists, and we brought together a group of people that were sort of most directly impacted by some of the more serious events that we went through last year. And really the intent here was to provide hope and opportunity for these folks, that there was growth potential in front of them. Many of these people were, really obviously really struggling. And what we were able to do in that time is provide a roadmap towards recovery, towards healing. And so I just really wanted to highlight that piece, because I feel like it was a really important kind of as and when intervention in support of our workers. So next up, Alex is going to talk a little bit about some of the research we've done around mental health. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I'm just going to set up my screen here. All right. Can I confirm that you can see that?
Looks great.
Awesome. So hello, good morning. My name is Alex Lane. I am a operations specialist out of the Coastal Fire Center within BCWS, and I'm also a student researcher at the University of Northern BC, where I'm working on a master's degree in science in psychology. I'm calling in today from the traditional unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, where I work and live and play. So as Steve mentioned, I'm going to be talking just about the research that I'm conducting on mental health in wildland firefighters and support staff. And I'll just give an overview of this. I don't have specific findings because it's still in the last stages. So we've heard from several of our presenters that mental health in wildland firefighters is currently being challenged. It is kind of tied to these worsening seasons, these longer seasons. And one of the things that we're running into is that there's this real lack of research specifically in mental health in wildland firefighters. So there is quite a bit of research from other countries, Greece, Israel, areas like that. But the differences in organizational setup in terms of wildland firefighting, the differences in seasons, even in fuel types are really quite distinct. So it's very hard to tie those into BCWS, into BC firefighters, and how their mental health is implicated. So we have seen rates in US wildland firefighters. This is research from Stanley et al. In 2018 and from O'Brien and Campbell in 2021. And we're seeing these concerning rates of PTSD, depression, anxiety, substance use, and suicidal ideation. So fairly concerning numbers, especially when compared to this yellow column here, which is the Canadian general population. And my research really is looking at where are we in terms of mental health for BC wildland firefighters. Like I said, the organizational differences make it quite hard to generalize this information from the US to BC. And again, like quite concerning, especially in terms of these suicidal ideation numbers. So O'Brien and Campbell in 2021 found about 20% past year suicidal ideation rates, whereas Stanley et al. In 2018 found 55%, which is very, very high. So concerning numbers of past year suicidal ideation in wildland firefighters. And again, we don't really know what this looks like in wildland firefighters in BC. So my research that's currently underway is asking these questions. So what is the prevalence of PTSD, depression, anxiety, high stress, suicidality, problematic substance use, as well as post-traumatic growth in BCWS wildland firefighters and support staff? And this last piece is really important because overall in the research in wildland firefighters, it's focused on direct suppression personnel, and it's overlooked support staff, so people in dispatch, in communications, in command roles, like our RWCO, things like that, where people are supporting wildfire operations from the office, and they make up about 40% of our workforce here in BCWS. So an important piece of this puzzle. The next question ties into what Steve was talking about. So aligning with this national standard for psychological health and safety in the workplace, there are these 20 psychosocial risk factors that have been identified across workplaces, so not just in first responders, as having really important implications for employee mental health. So my research is looking at the individual level, so things like marital status, education, at the positional level, so how many fireline days, if people are direct suppression or non-suppression, and then at the occupational level, looking at those 20 factors at the psychosocial risk level. So my question is, how do these factors predict the observed mental health outcomes in BCWS wildland firefighters and support staff? My analysis is using multiple regression. So much like Jesse's, it's very complicated, and I don't have the time to explain it here. If you do have questions about this, you're welcome to send me an email. I have my information coming up shortly. But it's looking at the best linear prediction of these predictors in terms of the mental health outcomes. So being able to pinpoint where are these organizational factors impacting mental health, which individual or positional factors are most important in predicting mental health in these samples. So this research is in its final legs. I did the data collection over the last summer, so from mid-June to the end of September 2023, and I am finalizing the analysis and my written report, so almost there. And if you do have any further questions, you're welcome to send me an email. It's wildfirestudy@unbc.ca. And I always put this in at the end, if you or someone you know is experiencing mental health crisis. These are not just for BCWS staff. This is for anyone in British Columbia. Please reach out to these supports. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Alex. Keep your slide up for now because I have a question. But first, I'm just going to thank everyone. Despite you all saying that you were going over time, we actually ended like exactly on the minute to start our Q&A. So what an amazing wealth of information, and the depth and breadth of it, and the difference of topics and the different ways that BC is looking at the health and safety of people within the wildfire service is it's frankly quite amazing, and you should all be so proud to be a part of that because it is such an important topic. So thank you so much for willing to share that with all of us. I got a little bit of goosebumps. Alex, I believe one of the last questions we have here, but we're going to do it first, was about your y-axis, and I believe it's in regards to the first bar graph that you showed. So if you could just plot back through a couple of your slides. I think it's either this or the next was the question, if you don't mind speaking to those.
Yeah, so the y-axis is percentage rates.
Okay. If there's any follow-up questions for that, feel free to post them in the chat. All right, so this hopefully goes well. We have a lot of presenters. My hope is that the questions are somewhat angled towards people. So to our 7 presenters, please feel free to unmute as questions come to you. I will do my best to field them out of the chat and not stumble over wording. So one of the first questions that came in, I believe this was for Natasha, was, are BC wildland firefighters covered by presumptive WCB legislation for associated cancers?
So yeah, and I think someone partially answered that in the chat. And if there's anyone else on the call that would like to provide context as well, please go ahead. But yes, coverage in BC as it stands for presumptive cancer does also apply to wildland firefighters. It's limited and it's different across Canada, but it does include wildland firefighters.
Natasha, it also applies to mental health disorders as well, the presumptive coverage.
Steve, do you know if that is BC specific or is that across Canada?
Yeah, it's BC specific. So there was a change in our WorkSafe legislation that happened in 2018, 2019, I think it was. Formerly, it was written that firefighters would have this presumptive coverage, and it excluded wildfire. There was a specific provision that excluded wildfire, and that has since been amended. The exclusion of wildfire was removed from that piece of legislation. So we do have presumptive coverage for respiratory, heart disease, and some cancers and some mental health disorders as well.
Great, thank you. And I do know last week, Maria talked a little bit about the Association of Canadian Fire Chiefs workshop in December and shared a resource about that and the new bill going forward for a national policy as well. The next question was if anyone was aware if any of this exposure research might be used to endorse early retirement models for frontline staff, similar to that adopted by the USFS, US Forest Service.
Yes, I can take a run at this, and then again, if others would like to contribute, then please do go ahead. Early retirement is definitely a tricky topic that involves a number of groups, the union, the employer, etc. But yeah, this research certainly could be used to make that case. I think it's important that we look to other jurisdictions and see what they're doing and see how it might apply to the BC Wildfire Service. I know that there have been challenges in a number of ways around wildland fire staff being considered more like structural firefighters. And I think there's work going on. I would touch briefly on the national framework on cancers in firefighters that's started by Health Canada. Not to say that that's a specific, not that that's specifically addressing this, but I think there's more and more recognition that we are filling a type of first responder role. And I think that exposure research could play an important part in that. But again, it's a tricky topic with a number of groups that have various viewpoints.
I don't see anyone else chiming in. Thanks, Natasha. The next question comes from a BCWS staff member. Health surveillance or longitudinal multi-factor health outcome research. Have we looked into working with the BC Centre for Disease Control or BC Data Innovation Program respectively?
Yeah, thanks. I think this is Ashlyn's question. Thanks for the question, Ash. There was a part of the work in 2019 with Dr. Cherry that did look to link some of the feedback or some of the questionnaire data rather that we collected in 2019 with BC public health records. For a number of reasons I won't get into now, that was dropped from that part of the project, but it is something that I think is important to consider as we move forward on research. It didn't work out for that project. That was with BC Public Health, not BC Centre for Disease Control, but we had Sarah Henderson on the first flare-up February call. I think she's a great contact for us that we do exchange information with her. And the research that we're doing, that we're starting with the University of BC is not currently planned for that, but I would say it does go a step further in terms of the individual specificity of the health reports that those people will be able to get back. And I do think there could be an opportunity at that point to work more closely with the CDC, with the BC CDC or the other group you mentioned there, Ashlyn. I think the beauty of that project is that there is still some flexibility in terms of exactly what the back end looks like and how much funding we have or don't have for it, depending on certain grants. So in short, yes, that's something I think that is important to consider. It hasn't happened yet, but looking into it, I appreciate the question. Like if anyone else wants to provide info, please do.
Thanks, Natasha. The next question is asking if there are any ways that frontline or firefighters are being informed of carbon monoxide levels. Are the firefighters, frontline workers, perhaps wearing single gas monitors for carbon monoxide, or is this maybe something that could be possible in the future?
Sorry, I'm muted. I'll start this one, but I do think that Drew and perhaps Steve will have something to chime in on. There have been a couple of safety communications around carbon monoxide exposure in the BC Wildfire Service, and Drew is including carbon monoxide as one of the types of exposures that he's looking to inform people on when he's talking about pump safe work procedures and saw safe work procedures that he's working on that will be shared with the BC Wildfire Service. When it comes to having carbon monoxide monitors on individual people, that was actually, and again, Drew, please do add context if you like, but that was, Drew started with the BC Wildfire Service for a co-op term that he did during the last year of his master's at UBC. And that was his project, really, is for the first time, as I understand it, the first time putting carbon monoxide monitors on a unit crew over quite a number of fireline days. We're seeing how that can be carried forward and what it might look like to go more broad with that. So that is one of his projects as well. It's not happening yet currently. We are looking to other jurisdictions. I think it's the state of Victoria in Australia that's doing kind of a mind-blowing volume of carbon monoxide monitoring. So learning from them. But Drew, Steve, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'll just add some context. So for health research and exposure assessments, carbon monoxide monitors have been used for a long time on the fire line, but generally this is targeted to 1 to 3 days, and the devices are kind of handled by the researchers. In terms of a widespread ongoing use of them on the fire line, there's a few issues. one, making sure that we can get the data off them, that they are calibrated timely, that they, you know, stay clean enough to operate and things like that. Just like it would be a lot to manage having them throughout the province, like on every single individual, which is what Fire Rescue Victoria is doing. I think they're putting them out over, I think, 500 or 800 individuals. So yeah, they're using carbon monoxide monitors in a very widespread way. I think first steps into, you know, operationalizing CO monitors can be much more targeted. So like having one at every pump could work, or on every pump operator, and then maybe having them on crew leaders. So like one carbon monoxide monitor per squad could also be feasible. This year, we're continuing to use them in health research studies and correlating them with like air samples for particulate matter. And we're also using particulate direct reading instruments as well, because there's a little bit of controversy around how well carbon monoxide does track with particulate matter from wildfire smoke itself. But overall, I think that they will play a huge role in the future, particularly with respirators, because it would be a great way to just kind of supplement that huge blind spot that respirators have with carbon monoxide. So yeah, that's just what I'd like to add.
Thanks, Drew and Natasha. Jesse, this next question's for you. I know you have answered it a bit in the chat. I'm just going to reread it to you, and if you could answer it again, just so we can get it on the recording, that'd be great. So the question was, would portable EEGs be relevant to future work on cognitive effects? A quick Google search suggested the technology might be portable, cheap enough to try. A bit of a pie in the sky. I wonder if anybody's working on it.
For sure. Yeah, great question. I think EEG is a great tool, portable EEG. Nothing that I know of in the context of wildland firefighting yet, but I know that it might be coming one day. There's a researcher at the University of Victoria that I worked with a bit, Dr. Crew Olson, and he's done a lot of work with mobile EEG. It was our plan to originally include mobile EEG in my study, but it's difficult to get good quality data unless you have a researcher right there. So because we did completely remote collection, we weren't able to, but definitely something for the future in terms of next steps.
Thanks, Jesse. Natasha, the next question's for you, and it's jumping back to, well, the opposite of carbon monoxide detection, wearable. This person wants to know if a non-wearable carbon monoxide NPM data could also be of interest. So for example, collecting at a fire camp or other location, and could it connect with other research activities? Yeah,
thanks. I think this is Ash's question again. So I'll go ahead and start, and then Drew, if anyone else wants to provide context, please do. It is something we're looking at. As a quick example, I mentioned that we are leasing the mobile lab that's currently that's housed at Canada Wildfire. We have it in British Columbia, and there was some discussion about whether it would be a good idea to put some kind of sensor like the one Ashlyn's talking about on that mobile lab, so that we do have a gauge of that wherever the lab is. And that's still, you know, a conversation around whether that's a good option, whether we do want to do some additional type of monitoring of ambient air. So far, our efforts have focused a lot more on personal air monitoring, and that's because they are what really allows that tight linkage between what is happening at the individual level. The health research projects that I talked about that involved data collection from firefighters working on the fire line are really about, well, we're really about, you know, collecting urine samples, collecting skin samples, collecting questionnaires, and collecting air from the breathing space of wildland firefighters, so that those pieces of information could be correlated together and look at the individual level, and then the number of individuals in the study, be able to make some sort of broad but specific findings about what that population of firefighters was experiencing. And I think that personal air monitoring for many of the types of research we do is always going to be the gold standard, but it's also time consuming and expensive, and it does cause at least some impact to operations, and that people have to carry the pumps around. So I do think depending on the project, there could be a good use for more ambient environmental air sampling. It's also, sort of that cost benefit piece if there are, of course, public air quality stations that we can access. So if we're close to one of those, do we need it? Maybe not. If we're not, maybe it's a good idea, but it's not going to, of course, give you that specificity of what is in the breathing space of people, and what is in the breathing space of people can really change from moment to moment. So that's part of the reason why that's important. But yes, there could be a use for it, and we are looking into it. Drew, I see you have unmuted. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just add, first of all, it was a really good overview of kind of the differences between personal and area monitoring. What I really see the use for like a stationary area monitor for PM and carbon monoxide, et cetera, is for fire camps. So we can understand, which camps and when are they undergoing maybe some inversion events, and to what degree are our staff exposed? Because one of our significant risk factors in situations is where our staff are exposed kind of 24/7. They go to the fire line, it's socked in, they go to the camp and it's the same, and they never get away from that exposure. So we have actually procured a few air quality eggs, they're called, that we're going to be trialing this summer to try to identify some fire camps that they can be used in. And ideally, I would like to see fire camps kind of even internationally in all jurisdictions start assessing kind of air quality, particular to those fire camps, because like Natasha mentioned, they may be close to current air quality monitoring stations, but very often they may not be as well. So we can start to get a better handle on that. And also if we have those at ICPs and fire camps, we can start to implement like trigger points. Like if it gets to a certain level, we start like recommending or putting up posters for N95s, or make those N95s more like visibly available in the camp, as opposed to like in a warehouse trailer or something like that.
Thanks, Natasha and Drew. The next question was for Jeremy, who did have to step away. The question is regarding core stability, and the person's wondering if perhaps like yoga classes online or in person could be something that could be offered to help wildland firefighters build their core stability and prevent injury.
Yeah, I can take that one. Yeah, certainly. So one of the things that that Jeremy wasn't able to illustrate there is we actually have developed a fitness leaders course. So we've worked with a number of kinesiologists and athletic therapists, have built out a training regime so that our frontline supervisors can teach fitness based on injury reduction. So we've really shifted our thought here from developing super athletes to doing fitness for injury reduction specifically on that regard. As far as the yoga piece, yeah, we have actually partnered with a third party agency and made available to our staff a bunch of free online yoga stuff. So yeah, we're certainly acknowledging those lower back, hip injuries as a big contributor to time loss, and those are the ones that are most likely, that we can do preventative work on as well.
Thank you, Steve. There's a question here which I think is going back to when we talked about WCB coverage and presumptive cancers, and the person was asking, in BC, does it not go off the specific type of cancer, but rather it is occupationally driven whether or not you'd be covered? Is that correct?
There is a number of different types of cancers that are included within the legislation. One thing I will caution, though, is it is not as simple or obvious as we would like it to be. It's certainly, now that we are starting to see the people who are aging out of the wildfire service, or starting to find themselves getting ill much later in life or as they're retiring, that we would hope that they could just click a box and say, yes, I've been a firefighter for the last 25 years, I should have presumptive coverage. It is not that easy. People are being challenged to demonstrate their exposure over their career, over their lifetime. So one thing that I'm really encouraging, and I would encourage across the board, both for BC staff as well as nationally, is for firefighters to really think about taking a log of their exposures throughout their career. So anytime they've been, high, medium, low smoke concentration, number of fire days at that, if any significant exposures they've had to non-veg smoke, or critical, like structures burning or vehicle burning, like if you've had significant exposures, even if you're just recording it for yourself, it will pay dividends 20 years down the road when you try to get this presumptive coverage. So yeah, it's a really important piece that people log their smoke exposures.
Thank you, Steve. And I think that is very wise advice. I'm not seeing, we have a question. So the question is if anyone knows how grass smoke compares to timber. It's fairly specific. I'm not sure if anyone here is willing to answer that one.
Yeah, I can't say I'm an expert on it. I know, as you probably do, pose the question, that various different types of vegetation will vary somewhat in the composition of smoke that they produce. Certain types of vegetation are going to produce smoke that is maybe not immediately toxic to life and safety, but is certainly more irritating than others. But in terms of like grass smoke compared to timber, I don't know that I could really dig into that right now, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, I can't answer the question in terms of specifically grass and timber, but I know one of the major factors for emissions are the state. So like smoldering versus flaming, and often smoldering will have exposed the individual to a lot more gases, particularly CO, and flaming more particulate. It's not as simple as that, but if you do want to look more into that, that dichotomy between smoldering and flaming fuels is probably one of the most important factors.
Thanks, Natasha and Drew. And that my unmute quit working. Thanks, Natasha and Drew. And that brings us back to what we talked a little bit about last week, and the difference between complete and non-complete combustion, and the hazards linked to where in the past we might not have seen the hazards of the mop-up phase and that cold trailing and stuff as well. Not just in direct contamination, but also the smoke contamination as well. So anyone who has any additional questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. We do have about 8 or 9 minutes left. To our panel that's still here, if you have anything that you would like to bring up or discuss, also feel free to jump in. I have some questions about Alex and her work. So do you have a rough timeline at all of when you might have some results from that? Or I know it's like the worst question to get as a graduate student, but I think it's really great work, and the results from it could be really beneficial to a lot of people. I'm just curious if you have some goalposts out that you'd be willing to share.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm working really hard to get these out as soon as possible. So my current timeline, I'm aiming to defend in April, and then after that, disseminating the results to BCWS.
Thank you, Alex. And Eric, can I ask you a question about how was the process for implementing or introducing these programs to BCWS? In terms of, did you find you got support? What kind of timelines? You talked about how many train-the-trainer sessions you've had. So for one of the agencies that might be on the call that maybe doesn't have such a program available or isn't as prevalent as it is in BC, can you give a bit of an idea of the work behind the scenes to kind of get to where you've got?
Sure. Well, I guess I got to first tip the hat and also open the mic to Steve, who is the patron saint of all things health and safety related from an operational perspective. Steve was the one who birthed that program and really aligned it with our organizational strategic plan. People practices sort of being at the top of the priorities. So it's a very easy through line to recognizing that there's hazards that are out there that we don't have as effective mitigation strategies for as we'd like. So that was, I think I see a lot of the strength of getting support holistically throughout the organization, is everybody not only understands that that's the priority for the organization, but when it comes to real world fireline experiences, this is the potency of these programs is that the proof is very much in the pudding. When I said that these are like concrete tools, these are the tools that I'm sure anybody else here who's had soot on their face knows that we need. Like, yes, like it's sort of like quenching a deep thirst. You know that we've been hungry for this sort of thing. You know, I can think of a bunch of times that I've encountered a member of the public who is experiencing a mental health crisis, and I have to, as part of my work, interact with them. Like, I need skills for this, and these are the skills. I've been through, you know, critical incidents where I think like, boy, I need some kind of support, but don't know what. And then had, you know, I say that I'm not only the hair club for men president, I'm also a client. You know, like I have used these services as well as being the purveyor of these services, and I think so. There's organizational buy-in that's sort of stated through our values, but there's also just the sheer quality of the actual product. I think that speaks for itself. So I would say those are the two ways that have allowed these programs to be as successful and as long running as they have. Steve, do you have anything else that you'd add to that?
Yeah, I think from an organizational support perspective, you know, really this starts with sort of our strategic goals and broad alignment. And Eric kind of mentioned that you know, right at the core of sort of our values is people and providing for people. And so, you know, it took a while to get here, certainly, but, you know, like I mentioned, sort of following those really extreme fire seasons, and since then we've had even more extreme fire seasons, and just recognizing that we need to take care of our staff if we want them to stick around. Partly, so, you know, part of this is an attrition problem, right? Is we're trying to address burnout before it happens, so that we can hold on to staff longer, hold on to that valuable experience. So that's a big part of it, and that was acknowledged at sort of the organizational level. And looking, you know, specifically at the Resilient Minds course, like we did explore a lot of other options out there. So we looked at the road to mental readiness. We looked at the stress first aid for first responders. We looked at the American model of the, I guess it's the stress first aid. So, you know, we did compare and contrast a number of different models, and this collaboration that we've established with the Canadian Mental Health Association, it seems to fill the majority of what we were looking for in terms of building a localized peer support network, providing people with those tools to be able to respond directly to the people that they're closest to, the people that they're sitting next to in a work truck or in a office environment, and then by extension, sort of the personal practices that can be put into place to build resilience over time. So again, there's lots of models out there, and I think they all have good value. This one we chose just because it seemed to fit the most of the boxes that we were looking for.
Thank you for that. There was a question regarding the program, and if you could speak to whether or not it has triggers for having mental health professionals deployed with IMTs, at least for partial shifts in certain situations.
We haven't got there yet. It's one of the considerations that we, you know, certainly is another one of the thought bubbles that's floating around out there, that whether that might be something we can do in the future. One thing that we are doing, which is I think it really is showing leaps towards this, is we have a new employee family assistance provider through TELUS Health, and we've been having ongoing conversations with that group of people. So there is a very large number of counselors and therapists that are being made available to government in general. And what we're doing is trying to work with TELUS Health to develop a unique subset within those counselors and therapists that are informed to the workplace, that understand the terminology of wildfire, that understand the type of work that we are asking of our staff. And so we're not there yet, but as we sort of educate this population of therapists, we're hoping to have like a distinct subset of counselors and therapists that are work informed and trauma informed, that are more available to our staff. And that's in addition to, we have a select, like we have a basically a 24-hour counselor therapist on call for BC wildfire staff. And she is an ex-wildfire fighter. She understands the type of work that we do. So it's very streamlined in that way. People don't have to spend a lot of time explaining what they do. It's automatic. And so when we're talking about deploying mental health therapists into camp situations or onto IMTs, yes, it's a possibility in the future, but we haven't got there yet. It's sort of one of those things that we'd like to work towards.
Thank you for that. We have about a minute left. I'm going to post an email here. So if anyone has questions that haven't got answered, or you think of them after the fact, send them to me at that email and I will make sure they go out to this group. This session has been recorded. It will be shared on YouTube. I'll try to get up there as soon as possible because there's just so much great information here. And I really want to thank, well, we're missing one, but I want to thank the 6 of you that are still here so much for coming. Just thank you for taking the time and being willing to share and talk. And I think BC is really leading the charge with a lot of this stuff in Canada, particularly with the mental health and the physical health perspective. And kudos to you guys, great work. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. And just thank you for all the work that you do.
Thank you, Karen. We really appreciate the opportunity to come on and host this session.
Yeah, thanks, Karen.
Okay, everyone, have a great, safe weekend. Bye-bye.